Hi everyone, you may already be familiar with the fact that my theory about the Trojan War is that it happened as late as 700 BCE. Now, one of the big issues with that is, what was Troy like at that time? Because obviously Homer in the Iliad presents Troy as being this big, formidable city. So if the Trojan War happened in 700 BCE, then did the city at that time actually match the way Homer described it? A lot of people think that after the Bronze Age, Troy it fell into ruin. It was destroyed and never rebuilt, and it was completely abandoned. And in fact, some online sources about Homer and the Iliad even suggest that Homer may have been inspired by the ruins of Troy that he saw in his own time. The reality, though, is that this is completely wrong. Troy was not uninhabited in Homer's time. It didn't fall into ruin. It hadn't become a heap of rocks and stones. It hadn't become like that at all by the time that Homer was writing. In fact, Troy was not only still inhabited, but it was still regionally important. We know that because pottery that's been identified as coming from Troy, called G2-3 pottery, as in G2/3 is the way it's normally written. G2-3 ware is known to have originated from Troy, and we find that on various islands in the area and even in the Black Sea. So we know that Troy was still regionally important as a trading city in that time, as late as 700 BCE. Also, its grand stone walls from the Bronze Age were still standing. They weren't just still standing, they were actually still in use. In fact, in the 700s, in the 8th century BCE, they had repair work done on them. So the grand Bronze Age stone walls were still in use, still cared for, still part of the city's defences. And in that time, 700 BCE, that would have been even more significant than it was in the Mycenaean era. So a lot of people say, well, Troy was a more substantial city in the Mycenaean era. That's true. But if Homer wasn't writing in the Mycenaean era, then frankly, that's irrelevant. If Homer says that it was a big, formidable city with impenetrable walls, then the only thing that matters is what was considered big and formidable and impenetrable when Homer was writing. It doesn't matter if Troy and other cities were more impressive in the Bronze Age, because Homer wouldn't have known that. His Greek audience wouldn't have known that. We know that with the benefit of modern archaeology. But the people back then, when the Iliad was written, wouldn't have known what the cities were like in the Mycenaean era, so that is completely irrelevant. So from the perspective of Homer and his contemporary audience, was Troy, at that time, a formidable city with seemingly impenetrable walls? Well, like I said, it still had its Bronze Age walls, still standing. Now, in the Bronze Age, that was fairly common. It was called Cyclopean architecture because the Greeks viewed those walls as being so massive and impressive with such large blocks that it seemed only giants like the Cyclops would have been able to construct them. That was fairly normal in the Mycenaean era, whereas after the end of the Bronze Age, in about 12 or 1100 BCE, that form of architecture fell out of use. And so in the Iron Age, all the Greek settlements that had been established in Greece and in Anatolia in the Iron Age, and we're talking several hundred years before 700 BCE, so a lot of Greek settlements and settlements from other nations had been formed by 700 BCE. So Troy, with its grand Bronze Age walls, would have been surrounded by other settlements, and in Greece there would have been all these other settlements, constructed post-Bronze Age with far less impressive defensive walls. In fact, one scholar even mentioned that the grand stone walls of Troy in the Iron Age, in about 700 BCE, must have dwarfed, by comparison, all the other more recent Greek settlements that had been founded in the area, as in after the Bronze Age. So it doesn't matter if it was less impressive than it had been in the Bronze Age. The point is, compared to all the other cities that were around, Troy would have stood out. It would have stood out even more than it did in the Bronze Age, because unlike in the Bronze Age, where loads of other cities had similarly impressive walls, in 700 BCE, this was very rare. Only the cities that basically had survived since the Mycenaean era still looked like this. All the more recent cities didn't look like this. They looked far less impressive than Troy. So even though it may well be true that Troy by 700 BCE was, well, I wouldn't say a shadow of its former self, but certainly less impressive than it had been in the Bronze Age, that doesn't matter. The point is, could Homer have described that as dramatically impenetrable? Well, yes, he absolutely could have, because that's what it would have seemed like in comparison to everything else that the Greeks at that time were familiar with. So, in fact, rather than this being an issue, rather than this being something which weakens my theory about the Trojan War happening in 700 BCE, I would say this is something that actually fits better with the evidence from Homer, because it makes more sense of why the walls of Troy receive such attention in the Iliad, why it's such a point about Troy having impenetrable walls. It makes more sense in an Iron Age, Archaic Era context than it does in the Mycenaean era, where that was fairly common. Of course, I'm not saying this is like a smoking gun or a piece of definitive evidence, but it does, I would say, tip the balance more towards my theory than towards the traditional Mycenaean era date. Certainly, it cannot be viewed as an issue with my theory. I think it's perfectly consistent with the evidence. So that's just one of many, many lines of reasoning and pieces of evidence which I argue converge to support the date of 700 BCE for the Trojan War. But see more in my book, The Trojan Kings of Britain, Myth or History.